Good evening and welcome to the final presentation of Avalanche Canada's 2022 to 23 webinar series. I'm Lisa Parazzoli and I'll be your producer for the evening. Nancy Geismar is our moderator. She's looking out for questions in the Q&A box and will be adding links in the chat box. We're so glad you could join us tonight. We hope you're having a great season recreating in the backcountry, although it's possible that some of you have already switched to climbing or biking. As you'll hear from this evening's presenter, adventures in the snow don't have to be over. Our mission is to help educate backcountry users so you can play safely in the mountains throughout the winter and spring. We want you to know more, go further, and come home safely. First, we would like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of 4 nations, the Sinixt, the Secwepemc, Ktunaxa, and Syilx. As a national organization, we also acknowledge the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations on whose land we live and recreate on. Before we start tonight's session, we would like to take a minute to thank our sponsors. We are very grateful to our sponsors for being loyal in their support for us during these challenging economic times and working with us to reach more backcountry users throughout the winter. We have our government partners, our program partners, our premier sponsors and supporting sponsors, and our contributors. This evening's webinar is sponsored by Teck. Teck has generously supported Avalanche Canada for the past 12 years. Their funding has enabled us to create and maintain our South Rockies field team, which has helped us make invaluable strides in that region. Our South Rockies field team also serves as a model for our 5 other field teams. Teck's commitment to public avalanche safety has made a positive impact on backcountry riders in southeastern BC and southwestern Alberta. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping notes. First, everyone is muted automatically. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. To do so, just click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll unmute you so you can ask a question. Another way to ask a question is in that Q&A box, also found at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A box for questions as opposed to the chat box, as they tend to get lost in that chat box. Lastly, be sure to stick around until the end of tonight's webinar, as we have a few Avalanche Canada goodies to give away. Tonight's presentation is all about spring conditions. This presentation covers all the factors in play you need to be aware of when you're recreating at this time of the year. Whether you're on skis, sleds, snowboards, snowshoes, or ice climbing, you'll want to track weather inputs that can affect the snowpack. Sunlight, rain, warm temperatures, overnight freezes, these can all impact your safety and how fun your day is. As the days grow longer, and spring entices more people to head into the mountains, it brings both challenges and benefits. We'll be looking at how things change and clues that the snowpack is becoming unstable. Our presenter this evening is Drew Nyland from Avalanche Canada's Yukon field team. Drew is no stranger to cold, snowy climates, having developed ski programs in Baffin Island in the high Arctic for the past 8 years, as well as being an avalanche technician and ski athlete. Drew has a number of epic spring traverses under his belt and is well-versed in planning days when the seasons turn and conditions change within an hour. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Drew. Enjoy tonight's presentation.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. I thought to start things, it might make sense to put out some polls just to see where everyone is, how they get into the backcountry, and what their levels of training are. So maybe, Lisa, if we could start a poll for how people access the backcountry, that'd be great.
Yeah, the poll should be up. So this first poll is about your mode of travel. How do you like to get out there in the backcountry? I'll give just a few more seconds to answer that poll. Don't be shy. All right. And it looks like we've got our results. Quite a few accessing the backcountry on skis or boards. We have a few sledders with us and a few snowshoers or hikers and a nice couple ice climbers out there as well.
Awesome. That's a nice mix. I'll do my best to try to touch on some best practices for all of the above since we've got everyone here. And then the other one I was hoping we could do would be your level of training.
Great, and that poll is up. Remember, there are no right or wrong answers here.
That's right.
I'll leave just a few seconds for people to complete that poll. All right, and we've got our results. Looks like a pretty good mix. Some have no training, some have a little bit. Quite a few, about over 50% have AST1, and then we have about 24% of AST have taken AST2, and then a few who have taken professional level training.
Awesome. Yeah, and we can speak to a bunch of those different levels as we go through this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me a yes if that went through good, Lisa.
It looks great, Drew.
Okay. So thank you so much for having me first, Avalanche Canada, and then thanks for everyone that took time out of their day today to come and watch this. I really do hope that you take something home from this, take something out into the backcountry, into the mountains, and that you find value in some of these tidbits that I picked up over a number of years, and mostly I've learned from many great mentors who I've had in the mountains, and so feel very privileged to have the opportunity to pass these along. I'm gonna talk about a lot of the transition. The spring and the winter are obviously different, but there's a transition period. It's not really black and white. When are we in winter and when are we in spring? It's not a particular day that happens and then all of a sudden we're in spring conditions. There's a transition. We're going from winter to spring. I'm coming to everyone from the Yukon area, actually the area around Atlin, British Columbia, the home of the Taku River Tlingit people. And so some of this stuff I'll talk about is somewhat northern, but it'll apply to everywhere. You'll see some of my graphs and charts are just relative to my local mountains here, just because they're near and dear to me. So what's the defining bits of winter and spring? So I think first what we'll talk about is like the differences in winter and spring. Then we'll talk about how that affects the snow. And then lastly, we'll go into like actionable, tangible things that you can take into the mountains that you can use to make better decisions or make more informed decisions about what's going on around you and how you can get back home safe. So some of the big stuff here is fairly obvious. Some of it has greater implications than may seem on the surface. So in winter, we've got short days. The sun is lower in the sky. And when I say lower in the sky, I mean its proximity to its horizon. That's really what we're talking about here. And we'll really dive into the sun and how that affects the snow in the snowpack part of this. And then it's typically colder in the winter. These are just, typical things. Spring, we're thinking about longer days. So a longer opportunity for the daytime warming to affect the snow. That's a big deal. Up here, it's a really big deal because days are now, 14 hours already. So that's a bigger deal the further you go north. The sun is higher in the sky, so further away from the horizon, and it's generally warmer. Two pictures, and it's pretty obvious to me which one's winter and which one's spring. But there's a transition. It's not always so obvious. The snowmobiler on the left of the screen is deeply impacting the snowpack they're in. They have the ability to get, way down into the layers of the snow. And in the spring, typically, we see the skier on the right-hand side of the screen is only really able to affect the uppermost bits of snow. That doesn't mean that the riding in the spring is bad by any means. It's my favorite time of year. But typically, our mind is more focused on that very superficial snow. So if we jump into winter snow, we're talking about snow that's typically below zero all the way through. It's not turned to slush. It's quite cold often. And it's defined mostly by layers. And the layers are a history of the entire season, really. You can see old storms, you can see the wind events that have happened, you can see times that it's been warm. And so a winter snowpack is typically very layered. And when you dig a snow profile, if you're in the professional category or the AST 1 or 2, that's a lot of what we do. We dig a hole, we take a look at it. We're looking for those weaknesses in the snow, right? That's typically a very winter snowpack. There's some avalanche problems that are associated with winter. All of the avalanche problems can happen in winter. These are the ones generally associated with winter. We're thinking about wind slabs a lot. Persistent slabs, that's been a big one throughout British Columbia, throughout Western North America this year. We've had some really weak layers in the snowpack that have gotten buried. In some cases, they're persistent. In some cases, they're deeply buried in the snowpack, and we'll call them deep persistent layers. Storm slabs, so new snow that won't stick to the old surface. And then loose, dry avalanches. So when snow falls and it has no continuity whatsoever, and if you start it moving, it starts falling down, much like sand would off a sand dune. So that's kind of winter snow, what defines it, and the avalanche problems associated with it. We're really trying to go from like the driving mechanism all the way up to the tangible avalanche stuff, and we want to cover the whole ground in between. Spring snow. So though the snow won't be greatly above zero, the daytime temperatures could be. And with the inclusion of the solar effect, temperatures could be quite warm. So spring snow is defined typically by being quite warm in contrast. And it has fewer layers. That doesn't mean it has no layers. And we know layers are typically the area that will have an avalanche propagate on or start on, or carry through terrain. And there are fewer layers in spring snow. That doesn't mean they're less dangerous necessarily or less problematic. It just means there's fewer of them. I typically define the spring snowpack in the top snow. And the top snow is the snow that's melted and frozen and melted and frozen over and over and over again throughout the days. That's the top part of the snow. And then the rest is the lower part of the snow. And as we get later into the spring, there's fewer and fewer layers in that lower part of the snow, and the surface layer gets thicker and thicker. Some of the avalanche problems associated with a spring snowpack are a wet slab. A wet slab would be when the entire snowpack gains an excessive amount of moisture. There's free running water in the snow, and it cuts the snow out in a big slab avalanche. It's very dramatic. They can be quite slow, but very dramatic. Persistent slabs. So in the spring, we rethink a lot of things. We try to reimagine what the weak layers were in the snow throughout the winter, because as the temperature and as the water potentially from the surface of the snow as it melts percolates down through the snow, those persistent layers have the possibility to reawaken, kind of thing. So we're gonna do our best to remember what the layers were in the snow that we were concerned about throughout the year, because they may come back to life. We say that kind of language a lot in the avalanche world. Those layers might rear their head or come back because of the change of the snow. Because the snow is changing, it refines that weak layer and has the ability to cause an avalanche. Deep persistent layers as well. Storm slabs. So we can imagine that surface snow that's on the ground that the skier is skiing on. Overnight, it freezes hard, board hard, and then that new snow potentially falls on it. And if that snow is cold or has low moisture content, it won't actually be able to stick to that hard surface all that well. So storm slabs are very much a thing in these like kind of fluky spring storms that sometimes bring quite a lot of snow. They'll be falling on a thick and hard and potentially slippery melt freeze crust. And then wet loose. And a wet loose avalanche would be the continuation of what you might call pinwheels, or you think of a little tiny bit of snow starting maybe from below a rock, and it starts becoming like a snowman ball, and then that just becomes more and more and more until it's pushing a mass of snow down the mountain. That would be a wet loose avalanche. So those avalanches are typically associated with the spring snowpack, but aren't exhaustive. All of the avalanche kinds can happen at any time of year, really. And cornices. We start thinking about cornices a lot. Cornices typically, of course, this might seem like a lot of information in one little snippet, but cornices typically formed over the winter on the lee, so the side that the wind doesn't typically blow, which is typically a northerly aspect somewhere. And then in the spring, we get a lot of solar effect on the south, and it starts melting out what we call the root of the cornice. So as the cornice is hanging over the north, its roots are on the south, and as those start to melt out, you start thinking about cornices. So there's a bit of forecast changes that happen. So a bit of forecast changes. So we start seeing a big transition at avalanche.ca about the kind of messaging we put out, and that changes everywhere, but typically happens sometime in late April. We'll do the transition, and we'll see on the top left of your screen, we see what a standard avalanche forecast from Avalanche Canada looks like. It's got forecasted hazard ratings, danger ratings for alpine tree line, below tree line. And then in the spring, we start thinking more about temperature. So we put this symbol up here, and it's got this green check mark and the red X and the temperature thermometer up down thing. But that's actually a really great piece of information. When things are cold in the spring, when we've had a big warm up, stuff has melted, the surface is soft, and then we get a really hard melt up, conditions become quite low hazard. Like we get into that low category pretty quick because the whole surface of the snowpack is frozen solid. Then as the temperature starts warming, and especially as the temperature starts warming beyond what it's warmed in the past, we start having, high or extreme avalanche hazard all in the same day. So that's why the forecast changed from a winter forecast, where it's kind of the same temperature around the mountain, there are similar conditions everywhere, and we can assess how the snowpack is, versus in the spring, we really start transitioning to, is that crust solid on the top and holding everything together? Or has it broken down and water is running free through the snowpack and things are very weak? They've become very much weakened by the running water, and now the snowpack is in the high or extreme hazard range. So we'll go into mechanisms. That'll be the next section here. And the big mechanisms we'll talk about will be temperature and the sun. So this is a graph for the White Pass. The White Pass is the ski area in the Yukon near Whitehorse and near Atlin. And all we're looking for here is a daytime high and an average daytime low. And we note that the spring, or the classical spring temperature-wise in my area, is somewhere around March into end of May. And that lines up pretty well with how people use the mountains and recreate here. Because we see a daytime high in late March or an average high of 0 degrees. And then overnight in May, we get 0 degrees. So by the end of May, it's no longer freezing overnight. And so snow is disappearing really fast. The sun, this is a graph for Whitehorse again, of course. This will be exacerbated for many people that live in southern British Columbia or Alberta, but this shows just how much daylight, how much opportunity the sun has to affect the snow. We'll see that in January, there's 6 to 7 hours of sunlight maximum. So it's got 6 or 7 hours of the sun to influence the snow. But by the time we're in April, we're up into the 12 to 14 hours a day. So double the amount of sunlight, regardless of if it's sunny, regardless of if it's a warm day, there's twice as much sun time available. So those are all playing into why it's warming and the effect the sun can have on snow. This is actually from a photography app, but I think it highlights something really important that's sometimes hard to calibrate to midwinter. So midwinter, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. But in the winter in Canada, and then the further north you go in Canada, the more it's exacerbated. But the sun will rise in the southeast and set in the southwest. And we see on the graph on the left, or on the photo on the left, just exactly where the sun is as it crests the horizon and then sets again. So the aspects that are affected by the sun are not so many as in midwinter. And then if we look at the photo on the right, we of course see that the sun is there setting, north of true east and north of true west. So the sun is now having an effect on multiple aspects. We're starting to think about the south being the most solar impacted aspect, but the west as well, because the day has already warmed, right? It's already come to noon, and now as the day's warm and the sun has a punch, we start thinking more about the west. So it's south and southwest, and then into west as we get into later spring. The morning, of course, the easterly aspects gets the same amount of sunlight as the westerly one does, but on the easterly side, it's morning. So the air temperature could be buffering how strong the sun is. So we really start in the later spring, or as winter transitions to spring, we start thinking about the south and southwest being greatly sun affected, rather than just the truest south aspects. So here we'll look at a couple graphs from a couple different days. Once again, this is from my area up here, or where I reside. So we see on December 21st that the sun is approximately 7 degrees above the horizon, which is very little. So the sun kind of rises, it rolls along the horizon and sets again. By March 20th, we see that the sun is 30 degrees up. So it's starting to come, through the sky. It's starting to hit the snow on a sharper angle. And we'll talk about that through this next bit, but we call that the angle of incidence. And then by April 29th-ish, we hit 45 degrees. So that's when the sun, a sun ray is hitting the ground, flat ground. We got to remember this is all flat ground at 45 degrees. If that ground is steeper, the sun will hit it more straight on, but on flat ground. So I usually think that late April, where I am, the ground snow on flat ground, maybe on frozen lakes or in large meadows, starts to disappear very quickly because the sun is hitting it at an oblique enough angle that it is now getting into the snow. It is no longer bouncing off. And we call that the angle of incidence. The angle of incidence is the angle at which the sun hits the snow. And snow is shiny. It's kind of shiny. It's white. And so in the winter on flat ground, we're talking flat ground right now, the sun actually can't deliver a lot of its energy into the snow. It bounces off the snow and loses a lot of its energy. We'll talk about steep solar often. So steep solar will be steep south-facing areas where in midwinter conditions, so when the sun is low on the horizon, the sun has the ability to deliver out its energy into the snowpack on steep solars. And what this will look like to people in the field could be that on sharp edges of tree wells, let's say, there could be little icy edges around the whole thing, right? And what that is that's where the sun has been able to impact the side of the flat snow, and it's been able to melt it. It's unable to do that on less steep angles because it's bouncing off. So shallow angles reflect, and shallow angles will reflect energy, that's right. And as it becomes steeper and starts impacting it directly, we'll start getting that melting effect midwinter, which is then a precursor to how it will take place in the spring. I need to pause for 1 second here just to plug my computer in. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So that's the angle of incidence. And I'll just get back to here. Great. So then after we talk about the angle at which something can hit, we want to talk about the object that's being hit by the sun, what its level of albedo is. So let's talk about the albedo effect. And really this is on white or reflective surfaces. This is another thing that's preventing the sunlight from getting into the snow, from delivering its energy into the snowpack. So in a high albedo situation, which snow would be, potential, up to 80% of the energy in the sunlight is getting bounced off. It's reflecting back out. Whereas in a low albedo circumstance, up to 90% of the energy from the sun can get delivered into that object. And it's really got to do with color. So we think of low albedo objects in a transition from a winter snowpack to a spring snowpack of being typically rocks. Could also be trees. Trees have a low albedo as well. They'll absorb a lot of heat, and you'll get those icy edges around large trees. That's from the sun hitting the tree branches absorbing more of the heat, melting the snow, and kind of raining down on the snow directly below it. You'll get these really icy and kind of dimpled crusts in forests. But on a large alpine piece of terrain, you might see dark colored rocks in the spring, maybe the first time they're getting a lot of sunlight, and the sun in the spring has now climbed higher in the sky. Those rocks can actually become quite warm, and that's a typical trigger point as we transition. So once the snowpack has really transformed into a spring snowpack, it's kind of two layers. There's snow underneath and hard crust on top. I'm not thinking so much about those black rocks anymore that are way high up. Even though they're getting warm, the snowpack has had a chance to settle. The crust is holding it all together. Having said that, when the transition hasn't quite happened yet, the first couple times those rocks get warmed up excessively, that's a great trigger. You can imagine using a hot knife to cut through the snowpack. That would be a really easy way to get some layer potentially in the snow to trigger. So we'll see often a sign of that being the small, wet, loose avalanches, and most of them will propagate at dark colored rocks on steep south-facing slopes where those rocks have become very heated and they've weakened the snow around them, and they've been able to start something moving that only is able to take the superficial snow that's become moist from the warm temperatures. So that's the albedo. Actually, one more thing on the albedo is that as we transition late spring, if you're someone that really pushes spring into summer, if you're ice climbing or even alpine climbing, the albedo, the general albedo of a slope decreases as we move into the spring. So small snow patches are surrounded by this dark colored foliage or stone and so the sun and the temperature are able to impact that snow that much faster because it's surrounded by this dark color. So if we're thinking about alpine kind of environments in the late spring, if we're recreating that time of year, we want to think about that too, is that the sun has an even greater power in those times when the entire snowpack is potentially surrounded in stone. So the snowpack itself changes. It's not night and day, but it changes over time. As we transition into that crust on top with pretty much the same snow underneath, we're into spring, right? We talked about in the last section the mechanisms that drive that, and most of them have to do with where the sun is in the sky and the air temperature. So we want to take with all that information is we want to transition it into red flags. Now, they don't have to be red flags. They could be yellow flags, or they could be whatever kind of system you want in your mind, where you can recognize that change has happened. So maybe you made a decision to do something, but you're going to identify that things are different than you thought they were. And if it's one of the things I list here, I hope people recognize some weight to them. That's all we're hoping for. It doesn't mean that if you see one of these things, it's time to go home that day. It just means that you are picking it up as this is a hazardous piece. This might be a subtle clue that things are changing. But when we're out there in the mountains, we need to pick up as many clues as we can as the day goes on. Starting right from having a trip plan and checking the forecast, and then all the way out to where's the sun in the sky? What are the clouds doing? And the whole gamut between. So red flags above freezing temperatures. Now, above freezing temperatures, one is really hard to guess. So this is my pitch for everyone that's listening here to carry a thermometer. I couldn't recommend it more. It is so hard to guess if the air temperature is above 0 degrees. It's easy to feel the sun, the heat of the sun, but often in the spring we need to travel underneath slopes where we're trying to estimate if it's melting up somewhere or where we are, or if we're moving a lot, it feels really hot. And if we're sitting around, it feels really cold. We're not great thermometers. So I really recommend carrying a thermometer. If it goes above 0 degrees, this is the kind of that's maybe more a yellow flag. We identify that that's a change. We know now that where we are, given our thermometer, that things are melting. We are transitioning into the melting part of the day. So hazard, we in that little symbol we showed, we're transitioning from the green to the red. Doesn't mean we're at the red, just means that we're starting to go that way. One that I think about a lot that I often talk to people about is it's great to know if it's freezing right now, if it's melting right now, but it's also really important to know how much it froze last night. So my spring kind of pre-trip check of weather involves a lot of looking at last night's temperatures. If it was -1 for 2 hours, it probably didn't freeze enough to even carry me on my skis. If it was -10 for 6 hours last night, it's probably a skating rink and I definitely need to bring crampons. So there's different things I'll get out of that, but mostly I'm getting that if there wasn't a strong refreeze last night, then maybe we didn't reset all the way back to the green. We didn't get all the way back to low because it didn't get that crust. And we know that that crust is holding it all together in the spring. If it froze last night, for how long and how cold was it? And we can check that if we don't have weather stations where we are. If you're in a remote place, we check that by checking how thick the crust is. This crust, breakable, didn't freeze for that long. This crust, it froze for quite some time last night. And then if it didn't freeze last night, this is a good one. If it didn't freeze last night, when was the last time it froze hard? Because now we're starting to, maybe it didn't go all the way back to low overnight, but maybe it got back to moderate, maybe if it cooled. But if it's been now 2 or 3 nights, I'm thinking about the whole snowpack being weak, being very weakened by the temperature, potentially having water run through it. So that's gonna clue me in that things are changing, and that with very little input potentially could change very drastically. So another one that's a red flag for me and is somewhat relative to crust depths or thicknesses rather, is sinking. If I walk out in the spring out of my car, off my sled, and I sink up to my knees, the crust didn't form last night. And most of the snow under it is already transitioned into a weaker kind of snowpack. We can measure the historical thickness of the frozen surface in places. We go to really shady places, look for how thick the crust is there, and to try to get a sense of how much it refroze the past couple nights. But really, the alarm bells go off when I start feeling like I'm sinking. Even more so if I start sinking while I'm standing on my skis or snowboard or snowshoes. Because all of a sudden I'm thinking, now there is nothing continuous. No longer is it kind of some crust over kind of some old frozen snow over the rest of the snow. It's like all of that has fallen apart, and now my skis, snowboard, or snowshoes are just punching all the way through. And that's a sign that the snowpack has become exceptionally weak. And then when it's broken down like that, when we feel that sinking feeling, no pun intended, when we feel that, we know that it's become very, and we could potentially be on a hair trigger. A little bit of sun or a little bit of temperature could really just push us over the edge. Cloudy skies at night. This is a hard one if you are traveling to where you recreate, but an easy one if you're out camping, if you're on a long traverse or something like that. Cloudy skies at night will insulate a little bit. So it'll keep things a little warmer. It'll prevent that really strong freeze that we're hoping for. And we are hoping for that if we're traveling in the mountains in the spring. We're hoping that the morning it's very, very hard and that we're waiting for that just uppermost bit to soften and become what we traditionally call corn or corn skiing. And then clear skies actually promote a stronger crust to form, partially because they don't insulate, and then partially because the planet will lose long wave radiation overnight and will assist in hardening the surface and cooling the surface. Wind, of course, is a driver all the time. And when I say that we're in the spring, or we're talking about a spring snowpack, I think it's important to recognize that it's not a constant, right? So we could get a spring snowpack, a fully springified snowpack with a hard crust over the rest of the snow. And we could have one of these fluke storms, right? We could have 20 centimeters of wet snow overnight. Totally happens. And so if that comes in with wind, we're going back into our winter mode and we're thinking there's a hard crust with new snow on top, potentially moved around by the wind, redistributed into common lees, and it's going to be a touchy wind slab for the first day or two. That can happen, absolutely. But it can do other things in the spring where it can maintain the surface temperature slightly longer. So in some cases, we can add nuance to things like warm surface temperatures due to the sun. So the sun is out, it's warming the surface of the snow because the angle of incidence is high enough in the sky that it's impacting the snow, but there's a cool breeze. It's keeping the snow surface cool. It's not letting that tiny layer of warmth on top of the snow rests there and continue to melt. It's blowing that away. So it can maintain the surface temperature a little bit. It can't do a lot, but it can do a little bit. And in some cases, enough. It can do enough. Some other things that can be tricky about the wind are that it can be warm. A classic would be a Chinook in the mountain parks, all the way along the Rocky Mountains. Warm wind coming from an upslope, so from the east typically, and warm winds can impact the snow very quickly. They have more pressure, they can push into the snow, they can break those surfaces down quicker. So wind can be, we really want to know if it's a cool wind or a warm wind, and because those can both impact what's going on. Rain, sad to say, rain happens in the spring. Couple of things about rain are that rain at the highway, at the parking lot, at the hut, doesn't mean necessarily it's raining where you want to be. So a couple things to think about there are, is it raining really hot? Is it raining in +10 or is it raining in +2? Those are different situations, right? Especially because typically, I think in North America, we don't ski down from the road. We're walking up from there. So we might be able to get through that freezing level and into a place where it's snowing, great. But if it's snowing up high and it's raining really hard at the car or at the highway or the hut, what is that going to translate to up high? Is it going to be a lot of snow? Do we need to rewind back to winter snowpack mode and start thinking about storm slabs and wind slabs? Potentially. Could that new heavy snow not stick to anything? Potentially. Could that new heavy snow contribute to rapid cornice growth and cornice failure? Absolutely. So we would want to dial ourselves back to those winter snowpack situations. which is a very different situation than rain at high levels. So there's nothing that can break snow down faster. Maybe, do I believe that? Yeah, I don't think there's, if there's nothing that can, there's not much that can break down snow faster than rain. So rain on snow does exactly that. The snow, a strong snowpack, we think about maybe the crust in this is exceptionally strong because all are touching each other and potentially frozen to one another. They've got a lot of bonds. It's well bonded. And what rain does as it hits snow is it percolates through it, trickle down through all the little gaps, and it melts the bonds. And so rain has an amazing capacity to take a very potentially robust snowpack or strong snowpack or a firm snow surface and break it down really fast. Sometime if the crust is thick enough, it'll just make runnels. It'll make like little little ditches, little streams and rivulets, and the water will run off the top. You see those in coastal areas typically, water runnels, and they can help protect the snow underneath. But if that rain is falling on more winter snow kind of surfaces or places where that crust isn't so thick or potentially so continuous, rain can quickly weaken the snowpack. And I would say if I was up in the Alpine on a ridge and it started raining on me in avalanche and I had to travel through avalanche terrain, it would be time to start reassessing a lot and start trying to figure out what the least hazardous way down was. And that could be potentially avoiding avalanche terrain at all. So rain's something you want to take pretty seriously, but I don't want to encourage people to get fooled by it's raining at the car, but it's +2 and in 100 meters it's going to be snow. Could still be a good ski day or riding day. So of course, my favorite red flag, and it's the most important red flag, is avalanche activity. Avalanches mean avalanches happen. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I say that often when I'm teaching courses or to guests or clients, but if we see avalanche, as of course they have to be recent avalanches, that means that the snow is capable of avalanching on its own. So of course it's capable of doing it when we travel through avalanche terrain. So there it is, avalanches mean avalanches can happen. Wet loose avalanches are a common springtime or later in the winter avalanche, and they look like these little, typically V-shaped with a lot of mass at the bottom potentially, but not a big fracture line, right? And wet loose avalanches we can see almost every day, and in some cases, but not all cases, they may be more of a yellow flag. They're letting me know, wet loose avalanches are letting me know that the surface snow is becoming wet, it's becoming moist, and snow is able to gain more mass as it rolls downhill. Doesn't necessarily tell me that the whole crust on top has broken down, because you can have a little wet loose avalanche just on the top snow, or maybe just around rocks with their high albedo have managed to melt through more of it. That's different than other kinds of avalanches we might see, in my opinion. Wet slab avalanches are an indication to me that the structure of the snow has failed or become weakened in its entirety. And the whole snowpack is weak, and recent wet slab avalanches, the day of kind of recent, are very alarming and should be taken very seriously. Cornices have a thing of have a tendency to fall together. So I usually, once I see the first cornice fall, I'm thinking about cornices essentially for the rest of the year. We've already had our first cornices fall here, and they're going to be extra touchy in warm conditions, in really strong sunlight, where their roots, like I was talking about earlier, have been warmed up and could be breaking down, and those cornices are going to fall off the other side. So we're looking at a large north face, not affected by the sun at all, but has a cornice on it on a sunny day. I'm thinking about that cornice having the back side of it melted off that ridge. That's something that's going through my mind looking at, potentially cold snow on a north aspect. So here we have some photos of some avalanches. These would be wet, loose avalanches um, on a sunny day on a steep slope by black rocks. So from this webinar, we're thinking about the albedo of the rocks, the angle of incidence of the sun, and that these particular avalanches may be just the surface snow sliding down. These avalanches might not send me home that day, might not put my spidey senses on. They will let me know information. They will be clues that I'm picking up throughout the day that the surface is getting moist or surface is getting wet, and that snow, if triggered, has the ability to gain more snow. I'm thinking about that, but it might not send me packing. This avalanche, on the other hand, if I saw this happen today, this avalanche has a crown, so the fracture, the break, where the snow has given up on a uniform surface and has traveled both vertically and horizontally on the mountain. This avalanche, if triggered by the sun, would give me pause, would give me great pause. This avalanche is likely, just looking at it, it could be a lot of things, but just looking at it looks like maybe early in the spring. This might be the first really sunny day, and that could be an old persistent problem, something that maybe we don't even have in the forecast anymore, something that we've maybe forgotten about that happened earlier in the year that got woken up by the sun because the sun had a higher angle of incidence. It could get further into the snowpack and potentially could trigger this kind of avalanche. I'm going to start thinking about the kind of terrain I'm engaging with, why that happened, and if that's the kind of terrain I hoped to engage with that day, be underneath, be anywhere near, frankly. I'm thinking that this avalanche easily could have buried a person, and it's going to alter my plan for that day in the spring. And if I see that it's a couple days old, then I need to start putting back into my mind all the things we talked about how much has it frozen the past couple days, how cold has it been, and how thick has that crust rebuilt to lock everything together and kind of hold the snowpack down. I could probably talk about spring and snow for a long time. I'm really happy to say that spring is happening up here in the north. It's been a cool-ish winter, so it's nice to see the sun come back. I hope everyone is appreciating the spring coming to wherever they are viewing this from. And I wanted to thank everyone so much for coming and listening to me talk about the spring and the snow. I want to hand it back to Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. That was a fantastic presentation. I know I certainly learned a bunch. We have a few questions. We did get a question from Ian McNabb. Ian, I'm gonna just unmute you so you can ask your question. Let me know if that worked. Ian, you should have a request to unmute. Otherwise, I'll ask your question. Ian had a question about if you recommended using cut blocks or Roosh block testing in the spring, in addition to looking at some of the information that you talked about in your presentation.
Hey, Ian, that's a really, really good question. And I hate to say it, but it's a depends question. It depends. It always kind of depends. It's in my world, in the way I gather clues out there, I really need to know what I'm after. So if my questions are about an early spring, we're thinking more wintry snowpack, will the sun be able to impact old buried layers? Then I want to say that, like, any kind of block test for everyone that's in here, if you're an AST1er, that might be your standard compression test, all the way up to if you're doing extended columns, Roosh blocks, whatever. All of the block tests have the ability to find those layers and potentially see if they can propagate. If you're trying to figure out if the snow, the crust, the heavy snow on top is weak in any way, cutting it out from its surrounding strength will alter your results to the point where they may not be telling you something super accurate. So I would hesitate to use. I hope that kind of answer. If Ian has a follow-up question, feel free to read that one too.
Yeah, great. We have another question. The question is, can you talk a bit about air temperatures versus snow temperatures?
Yeah, totally. So air temperatures are typically measured. Let's start with that. We measure air temperatures in the shade, a meter off the snow and 30 centimeters away from kind of surrounding things. And it will dictate a fair bit about how much added impact the sun can have, if the surface snow is going to melt. In contrast to snow temperatures, which are going to be a direct measurement, we usually use a thermometer with a steel probe, and we stab in the snow. And we also want to make sure that the sun's not overly affecting it. And typically we're going to use snow temperatures to decide exactly how far down the heat from the air or the sun or both is making it into the snowpack. So then to like tie that into Ian's question is, if I was worried about how warm the snow is getting, I might weight more heavily snow temperatures than I would block tests. So that those are kind of the ways we use air and snow temperatures.
That's great. Thanks, Drew. It looks like Natalie has a question. Natalie, I've just asked you to unmute so you can ask your question. Might have been a mistake. Okay, our next question is from Peter. The question is there any common pattern or most often planning about which aspects you would choose to ski earliest in the day and which aspects would mostly be better in the afternoon? Similar to planning the tour to be able to get the corn snow at the right time. Thanks.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
So
It's a
corn,
good one.
yeah, timing for corn skiing is an ancient and mystical art. And it's going to depend on the day. It's going to depend on the cloud cover, and it's going to depend how far into spring you are. You typically get best at it by having done it a couple days in a row. That's usually how I find I get it best. I can't really use last year to figure out what this year's corn cycle is going to line up to be. So some stuff I'm thinking about is obviously the north aspect is not going to have corn skiing. The east aspect only later in the spring, and the south and southwest. So if you were trying to go corn skiing for a day, middle of the spring, I would try to walk up an easterly aspect because it would be warm, but it wouldn't have moistened the surface. It'll be difficult travel going up potentially. Or you could use ski crampons, or however you're accessing it. You'd make it to the top, and you might ski a southerly aspect, or whatever aspect you can find where the surface has started melting, and that'll probably be a midday south ski. And then if you want to follow that up, is you would probably try to track that transition of the sun to move towards the west as the day went on, knowing that of course the west is going to heat up a lot faster, because in conjunction with the added sunlight, you're going to have the day being warmer, and it's going to have been warmer for longer. So we want to be careful as we chase the corn out to the west, because it could be a situation where it was great corn skiing on the south, and one more lap took it from green low hazard to red high hazard pretty quickly. So we want to watch that one. We don't want everything to break down too much. So we want to maybe be done our day by 1 o'clock.
We have a question from Ben. The question is there a reliable test to determine the relative strength of the crust layer? Something like maybe an extended column test, is that likely to give accurate results.
Yeah, so like we talked about with on Ian's question, it's really tricky. And I want to give everyone the silver bullet of, if it's this, then go, and if it's this, then don't. But it's just not quite so simple. There will be differences in, thin areas of snow will melt out quicker, deeper areas of snow will insulate better. So when I'm thinking about the strength of that crust, a lot of what I'm learning from my poles. Maybe I'm a skier. There's a way to do this on all of the forms of travel that people have, said that they do here. But as a skier, I'm thinking a lot about how much my skis are able to get into the snow, how much my edges will hold, and if I can bang my poles through the snow, through the crust on the surface. And once that stuff starts getting easy, it starts being not the place for me. But as it's harder, and as I'm like really high up in the snow, it's not wet on the surface, and it's really hard, I feel pretty good about that. It like everything with like everything with almost everything, it does take time. And having a mentor, there are a lot of great spring skiers out there. Latch on to someone who's a good corn skier, or someone who's good at this kind of whole chasing the diurnal cycle, because there's a bit of an art to it. But I really hang my hat on if I'm sinking or not.
Great, thanks, Drew. That's all the questions that we received.
Awesome, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for your time. All right. I think everyone will agree that spring conditions are changeable and vary depending upon your location, temperature, aspect, elevation, and the existing snowpack. I know it was certainly great for me to learn a bit more about how to plan my spring adventures. As promised, we have some Avalanche Canada prizes to give away. The first prize is this lovely Avalanche Canada goggle sock. If you haven't used a goggle sock before, they're very handy. Nancy has pulled some names from the hat. If you hear your name called, please send an email to producer@avalanche.ca. All right, Nancy, who is this wonderful goggle sock going to?
Lisa, that's going to Cassandra Ma.
Awesome. And then our next prize for the evening is this lovely Avcan toque, sort of a purple burgundy color. Nancy, who's our winner for the Avcan toque?
And that is going to Stephen Dalbello.
Great. And then for our third and final prize of the evening, a blue Avcan toque.
And that
Nancy,
is going to Trevor Richardson.
Awesome. Again, you can drop us an email at producer@avalanche.ca to claim your prizes. There are many resources on our website to help you learn more about avalanche safety and how to plan your trips into the backcountry. If you're just starting your backcountry education, definitely check out our online avalanche tutorial, Avy Savvy. It also features great terrain and route finding exercises, and the link for Avy Savvy is there in the chat. We are always working to update and improve the user experience of our website. We're currently conducting a survey that focuses on the usability of the avalanche.ca website. And that link to that survey is going to be in the chat here in a second. The survey takes less than 10 minutes to complete and will close on April 3rd. That's Monday. Thank you so much for taking your time to share your feedback. We appreciate your interest in avalanche safety. You can support essential programs here at AvCan by donating as little as $10. If you can afford it and would like to help, just click the link in the chat box to donate. This wraps up our season of webinars. We've so enjoyed bringing an array of speakers and a variety of avalanche safety and education topics to thousands of people all over the world. You can find recordings from this season and the past 2 seasons on our website. I know the link was already put in the chat, but we'll put it in the chat one more time just in case. And the video from tonight's webinar will be up there in the next day or so. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe through the remainder of this season, and we look forward to seeing you again next season. Good night.